welcome everyone to the first webinar in a two-part series organized by the Socioeconomic Rights Project at the Dullah Omar Institute in collaboration with the Center of Excellence in Food Security. By means of introduction, my name is Paula Knipe. I'm a researcher at the Dullah Omar Institute and I will be your moderator today. So for a bit of history on the Access to Food for Students project, it began in 2017 with the DOI and Center of Excellence to probe and proffer policy solutions to the problem of food insecurity at tertiary institutions nationwide, taking a human rights-based approach. The project has had various outputs and held a series of meetings with relevant stakeholders in the South African food security and education sectors. Most notably, a national colloquium on access to food for students in tertiary institutions in 2018, and a petition to the South African Human Rights Commission submitted in 2019. Today, we are here to discuss student hunger and the impact of COVID-19 on realizing the right to food of vulnerable groups, looking at what student hunger is and how it has been amplified by the COVID-19 pandemic. It has certainly highlighted many pre-existing challenges of unemployment, food price hikes, a lack of social protection, the fragility of working in the informal sector, and the inaccessibility of food, exacerbating the food insecurity of students. We've also seen a range of new challenges emerge with the shutdown of institutions, the economy, and society as a whole. This has meant that students have had to deal with the pressure of a public health crisis and mass uncertainty, all while remotely completing their studies. Therefore, this webinar seeks to provide a platform to students, experts, and civil society organizations to share their experiences on the impact of the lockdown on student hunger and how they are navigating this challenge. As this is certainly unprecedented territory, it is necessary to look at what is being done, what can be done, and what this means for students' rights to food in normal times, as well as for future pandemics. So the program will be as follows: the introduction, which I'm busy with now. We'll then hear from first Rhondelene Williams, who will speak on student experiences during COVID-19. Second, Dr. Shontal Wetton, who will speak on advocating for hungry students and the impact of COVID-19 on advocacy strategies. And then last but not least, we'll hear from Lindokuhle Mdabe, who will speak on the role of Chapter 9 institutions in addressing student vulnerability to hunger. After the speakers, we'll then have a 20-minute question and answer session, which will be led by my colleague, Fumilola Ndiyeni, also from the Dullah Omar Institute, and she'll also give the closing remarks. So a few housekeeping rules before we proceed. Please familiarize yourself with the mute and unmute button. Panelists, please unmute yourself to present. To the participants, please ask all questions in the chat where my colleague will repeat them during the Q&A, or please raise your hand if urgent. We are using only audio today as it seems to allow for the best and clearer communication. And then for the speakers, please maximize your 15 minutes for your presentation, and for purposes of timekeeping, if necessary, I will remind you when you have 2 more minutes left. Thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to a meaningful engagement on this issue. So without saying much more, may I please welcome our first speaker, Rhondelene Williams, who is currently completing a master's in food security with a focus on civil society organizations and the potential in realizing the right to food. Her research interests are social justice, local politics, and governance. Rhondelene, you have 15 minutes to take us through your presentation. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone, and Paula, thank you for that. I am very excited to be part of this conversation, and I am very interested in getting to learn everyone's insights and opinions around this issue, which is student hunger. So before I start, I'd like to say that it's important for us, before we speak about student hunger and student food insecurity, it's important for us to put the right to food into perspective. So I'm going to just quickly touch base on that by saying that when we speak about the right to food, we speak about the right to have access to sufficient food in order to feed ourselves and to meet our dietary needs. And this is a human right that is not only recognized in international law, but it's also a standalone right that is enshrined in our Constitution in Section 27 of the South African Constitution. So I'd also like to say that although South Africa has committed themselves to numerous global and African declarations and bindings, such as the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and more so the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, which says that if people are deprived of access to food for reasons beyond their control, the right requires the government to provide food directly, even though we as a country are committed to these declarations and what these declarations expect of us as a government or as a country. South Africa has no legal instrument or legal institute which puts emphasis solely on the right to food security and nutrition. And I'd like to also just say that the right to food in our Constitution, it's a standalone right. It's a right that makes provision for children. It's a right that makes provision for the right to food of prisoners and detainees. And even though there are multiple programs, which include the ECD, school feeding programs and grants, I'd like to ask the question, where do students fit into this whole picture? Are we not really seen as part of the vulnerable group? Are we not really part of the unemployed? I know that we're not eligible for social grants. My question is, so why? So for me, there's no real program that is aligned to our right to have access to safe and nutritious foods on campus. And this is something that we really need to look at when we speak about what the Constitution says about the right to food in particular, because it makes provision and it recognizes the rights of other groups. But what about the rights of students, and especially when students are on campuses? So when we speak about student food insecurity and student hunger, I'd like to mention that it's always been a problem. It's not something that just happened overnight. It's not something that COVID-19 is now all of a sudden highlighted. It's always been an issue. It's an issue before COVID-19. It's an exacerbated issue now during COVID-19. And I'm pretty sure it's going to be an issue way after COVID-19 as well. And when we look at this, we need to acknowledge that most of the students that are on our campuses, and especially if we look at, for example, the University of the Western Cape, are first and second generation students, which comes from poor communities. So just the fact that these students come from poor communities, does that not, though, I don't want to use the word imply, but are they not at risk of student food insecurity or student hunger? Are they then not vulnerable to experiencing student food insecurity? And also there's this false myth that exists, which is that when you are a student, you're part of the elite, which is almost saying that there's no way that as students we can be experiencing hunger. There's no way that as a student body we can't be experiencing food insecurity. And that is what it is. It's a false myth, because student hunger and student food insecurity, it does exist at our campuses. And because few studies have been done on food insecurity in higher education institutions, why? Is it because of the myth? Is it because we're not really part or seen as part of a vulnerable group? Is it because we're not really seen as part of the unemployed? So these are important questions that we need to ask. And if we look at statistics on a global scale, for example, if we look at Canada, in Canada it says that, or their statistics show that between 30 and 40 students are at risk of student hunger and student food insecurity. And if we look at the United States, 14 to 59% are at risk of student hunger. And then coming back home, research was done, and at the University of the Free State, 64.5% of students are at risk of food insecurity. And at UKZN, 55%. Now, if I hear these numbers, it's a concern to me. And in our society, and if we hear these numbers, it should raise red flags. We should be asking ourselves the question, but what is happening? And is it not a concern? And should something not be done about it? A couple of weeks ago, I had a conversation around this topic exactly. And I spoke about student food insecurity, and this person told me, well, you want free education and now you want free food as well. And I was shocked. I was so shocked by this answer, because when we speak about student food insecurity, it's not about getting free food. And when we speak about student food insecurity and student hunger, it should not be looked at in isolation. It's not something that we can just put there at the corner of the table, and that is a conversation that needs to happen on its own and not think about any other social ills that we are currently experiencing within our community. So student food insecurity can take on many different forms. For example, not having money for food, skipping meals on a daily basis, and not being able to meet our dietary needs, which means that, for example, if I have 60 packets of 2-minute noodles for the entire month, that is what I'm going to have. I'll have 60 packets of 2-minute noodles for the entire month. And with all of this, a student is also experiencing a lot of other psychological stress and shame that is attached to the myth that, you know, as a student, I'm part of the elite. As a student, I'm part of the privilege. So I can't be expected to experience student hunger and student food insecurity. So just breaking through those stereotypes and just breaking through that barrier is already a difficult part for a student. And research has shown, even though a little research has been done in this area, it shows that student hunger and student food insecurity is a threat to student success. It also shows that it's a threat to the mental health of a student. And furthermore, it shows that it's a threat to a university's graduation rates. It's a threat to a university's statistics. And we should be thinking about that. Now, so these are issues that we've been experiencing before COVID-19. It's 2020 and enters the COVID-19 pandemic. What is happening? We find ourselves in a situation where we are limited. So our movement is limited. The lockdown rules are we are not allowed to go to campus. We are not allowed to leave our homes. We are not allowed to leave our communities. So just to paint a brief picture of what a student's life could possibly be like during this, or possibly is during this pandemic, is that when I was at campus in the first place, there were many ways that I could support myself. Working as a tutor, working in the library, working in the stores or the shops that we have there, and those are ways of supporting ourselves. Even though we come from poor communities, or some of us come from poor communities, even though we are already exposed to student hunger, the little that we can do at a university can possibly just make the experience of student food insecurity a little bit, or at least not so bad as it could be in other ways. So we've got students that are now sitting at home, having to study online, having to think about data, having to think about resources. And with that, I think we can all agree that COVID-19 has negatively affected the economy. So what that then leads to is, as a student sitting here in my home, in my community, where my movement is limited, where my hands are cut off with regards to the support that I could have gotten at the university from my friends, from my peers, from my lecturers, from other programs that might exist at a university, I am now facing with my parents having to sit with retrenchment as well. So that this also adds on to the burden of not being able to sufficiently feed myself or meet my dietary needs on a daily basis. So I also now have to think about those things as well, which is job losses, myself and my parents. And ultimately, this aggravates a student's environment, or COVID-19 did aggravate students' environments and the experience when it comes to student food insecurity. And it does lead, or it did lead, to increased food insecurity, because there's so many other things that we need to think about now. And the fact that there's no access to on-campus food services, and that's another point that we need to look at as well. If there are any on-campus food services, and what type of food services do we also have at a university? Does the food services that's being presented at a university, does it meet my dietary needs as a student? And there's also the greater lack of support that we as students are currently sitting with. And again, accompanied by the stresses of online learning. So right now, the picture and the experience of a student during this COVID-19 pandemic is dark, because we have to compete with so many other things. And yes, when we think about support that has been given to the community during this program, during this period of COVID-19, there's been thought of the children. So social grants were increased, right? And we are not really part of the social grant. However, we were given the opportunity to apply for the 350 Rand. But yes, I might have a possible 350 Rand in my pocket. What else am I competing with? Who else do I have to support during this time? Am I going to think about the fact that, hey, but I need to have data on a daily basis? I need to think about how much my data costs as well. So how much is even left of that 350 Rand in order to feed myself sufficiently or to meet my dietary needs? So these are all issues that students are currently experiencing with, and it's been amplified during the COVID-19 pandemic. And with all of this, I can surely say that there's a guaranteed increase, or there probably will be an increased number of failures or even dropouts. Because as young as we are, students between 18 and possibly 24, or even a little bit older, it's too much for us to handle. It's too much for us to think about. And I feel that this is a conversation that is being ignored. This is a conversation that we're not really talking about. If we look at the Constitution and we look at who the Constitution is emphasizing and how the Constitution is recognizing different groups in society, what about students? What about the value that we place on students? The value that we place on students, not just about progressing their own lives, their own communities, but our economy as well. So when we talk about the way forward, yes, there are relief programs aimed at children and the elderly, but I believe that the way forward should look at explicitly including students as a vulnerable group into the right to food, explicitly looking at and recognizing that there is a need, that there's a desperate cry, that there's a desperate conversation like this that needs to happen within our community in order to address student hunger and student food insecurity. So it's time, I feel, to ask ourselves very important questions, whether we are students or whether we are academics or researchers or professionals, or whether it's government and civil society organizations. We need to ask ourselves, where do we put students in? How do we value our students and what they are trying to achieve? And what should be done? And when we look at these questions, I'd like to say that the purpose of a student is not just to study. It's not just to get a degree, but ultimately it's to improve our situation. Ultimately, it's to get a job so that we can get out of the current situation that we might find ourselves in, should it be in a negative one. It's to develop ourselves. It's to create something bigger and better and more fruitful than what we find ourselves in. So as a student, when we graduate and when we have things not to think about, such as hunger and food insecurity, it will positively impact our communities. It definitely will positively impact our lives. It will positively impact the graduation rates and the dropout rates of a university, which will positively impact the statistics. And I'd like to take this even a little bit further in saying that it'll definitely positive or impact our economy positively, because ultimately, as a student, you go into the job market, you decrease unemployment, you contribute positively to the economy. And by not having us stated, and not by recognizing the need to look, not to look after, but to make provision for the right to food, or realizing the right to food of students, what are we saying about the value of students? What are we saying about how we value students in our community? What are we saying about the future and the future economy? What are we saying about the social structures that exist within our future economy, and about the unemployment rate as well? So I believe that when we talk about student hunger, we talk about what students are currently experiencing, it's a desperate need. There's a desperate need to look at this, because it's not something that we can talk about in isolation. It's not something that we can just say, oh, you know what, now you want free food as well, so we give you the food and there you go. No, it has a ripple effect onto many other social structures within our community. And I think it's time for us as a people and as a community and as a country to really dig deep and ask ourselves, where do we fit students into our economy? Where do we fit students into our country? And especially what value do we attach to our students? So yes, Paula, that's something that I'm very interested to know about. And yeah.
Thank you so much, Rhondelene, for that insightful presentation and for really contextualizing student challenges during COVID-19 and also providing useful suggestions and solutions going forward. I'm sure you'll get quite a few questions during the Q&A. If you'll allow me to welcome our next speaker, Dr. Shontal Wetton, who is a registered dietitian and senior lecturer in the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of the Free State. Dr. Witten's work experience spans extensively across 25 years in several sectors, including public health, the UN, various NGOs, academia, and the food industry. She has contributed significantly to the development of child health and nutrition policies at a local and international level. Dr. Witten, you have 15 minutes to take us through your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Paula. I must admit that this is the first time in that 25 years that Paula had given you as an outline to me. It's the first time that I'm actually speaking to a student body and a student-centered research community. And so I had battled about how to position this particular presentation from the perspective of my focus on food and nutrition in the context of children, and how do I use my experience that I have been working in terms of repositioning nutrition as central to development. So I would like to ask you to please bear with me, because I am strategizing in my head based on Rhondelene's presentation now and some of the issues she's raised. I hope that my presentation is going to be able to give us some ideas, because when I started this, I thought, okay, what do I want to do? I want to bring to your attention that in food and nutrition, we talk specifically about vulnerable groups. And as the previous speaker said, students are not part of that vulnerable group presentation, because it is based on health and health outcomes from a physiological point of view. So when food and nutrition is most important as an outcome. But then I also want to bring to our attention that if we don't invest in young people, including in students, then we are going to have detrimental effects on their education. The data and the evidence is not as strong as we have in early childhood development or in primary school feeding. There we have strong data that if you feed, you have better outcomes in education. In tertiary education, it's not that clear cut. That the social impact, we know that hungry people are angry people. We know that malnourished children don't cope well and also don't have the social skills, because hunger and malnutrition is also trauma. And there is a physiological response to that. And when a country has a high rate of malnutrition, it affects its development and its economics. And that evidence is existing. So if there is inaction, it will be costing young people's lives. And maybe we need to be framing the food and nutrition conversation for students and institutions of higher education a little bit differently. So with this presentation, I want to give you some insights and then allow us to start thinking together and co-creating a narrative that can hook onto some of the drivers that drive food and nutrition interventions. So I'll be looking a little bit at the food and nutrition landscape, and the previous speaker has given some insights. We know about sustainable food and nutrition interventions that work, and the evidence is there for it. And then we have to think about how do we innovate and how do we scale this up for students, and what would that look like? So this picture I took myself in 1999, and it was during a survey which was called the National Food Consumption Survey, and it looked at children between the ages of 1 and 9 years old. And this particular picture is a picture of a 3-year-old girl who I have circled. She's standing between a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old. And you can see that she is stunted and she is small in stature. So at the time of that 1999 survey, we knew that 1 in 5 children were stunted. We knew that 60% of the children in the survey had multiple micronutrient deficiencies, which is also called hidden hunger, the vitamins and the minerals that actually affect brain development. And we also knew that children from rural and farming areas were more affected. And these children predominantly came, the stunted children predominantly came from food insecure households. So why is this important? It's important because back in 1999, the child that is a 3-year-old here, in today would be a child in higher education. So we have gone from childhood malnutrition and food insecurity to higher education. And we need to connect those dots and make those dots a little bit more visible. The most recent data that has come out now in 2020, which was called the NITS CRAM data, squarely puts the evidence down that one, food poverty has gotten worse. And if students are a reflection of society, as children are a reflection of society, then we know that students have been affected because money for food is a lot less now, particularly during the COVID lockdown and as we are going into a recession. So undoubtedly, these households are going to be strained and constrained. We know that hunger has increased. You will see in 2018, the General Household Survey had a lower figure of households that ran without money or didn't have enough money to last them for the month. And we see it has also increased. And then specifically around child hunger, we know child hunger has increased significantly. So these are not the vulnerable groups that you would ordinarily hear students being described as. When we talk in nutrition and health, we specifically talk about nutrition through the life cycle. And this is the life cycle that we focus on. And this is where the vulnerability lies. So the vulnerability during pregnancy will have an impact for the future generation. So maybe we need to be thinking about, why don't we talk about our students as future mothers, as future fathers? Because we know that poor nutrition in both the mother and the father has far-reaching consequences. And it's called intergenerational malnutrition. Then we get to the adolescent, and this is your 18, 19-year-old who's coming in as first-year students who also happen to have a very bad adjustment to higher education feeding environment because they've left home. They don't always produce or procure their own food. They don't know how to do that. And so it's another impact for them at not only having the food, but just being able to make food work for them when they get to university. They struggle with that. And then we move on to the adult and the elderly. So what I'm challenging you is about how do we talk about food and nutrition in the student environment as compared to how we talk about it in the health environment. And in the health environment, we have both global commitments for vulnerable groups We have national commitments for vulnerable groups. And I think it's about this vulnerability that we need to try and shift that narrative. Now, we talk about malnutrition through the life course, and I thought, let me put down some evidence that we have found. And the evidence that you're probably going to be more interested in is the last bullet, where food insecurity among students across several institutions in South Africa have shown that one, there's insufficient food. People don't have enough food for whether it's 7 days or 31 days or in the last 6 months. We know that the food quality is low because there's not enough money, but we also know food quality is low because students don't have access to preparing good food. They usually depend on families to do that. So when they are studying and they're rushing around, they don't actually choose the right foods. And we know that the diets that they are consuming are not optimal, and so they are not promoting. In the context of COVID, this is just exacerbated. The previous speaker has made comments on that, that we know that it has shown that food insecurity has more than doubled in South Africa, that the food relief that is currently in place and was put in place was not enough, that the cost of the actual food basket has gone up, which means that students who are on loans or students who are receiving support from NSFAS, our funding agent, national funding agent, is also going to not be able to stretch because that basket costs a lot more. And there's deepening food hunger and poverty. And we also know that in higher education, the minister this year said that, I just want to read that 50% of students across education, higher education, actually come from low income households. So these households have an added burden, the learning demands, as was alluded to, around the data and the IT support, and also that food was not enough in the households. So even less for students who need food while they are studying. This is a slide that I use often because these are the global interventions that are across those vulnerability groups. And I've highlighted in boxes the ones that are important, which talk specifically around the availability of food. And we know that in terms of food security, we need the availability, we need access, and we need the utilization. So when we talk about this, we already have commitment for vulnerability that a country must make sure that these foods are available, they're accessible, and they are utilized. In the context of food insecurity, we use this as a programming tool that shows us that when people aren't able to actually produce or procure their own foods in the red box, the country needs to provide it, needs to be able to have a humanitarian output, which we call survival aid. And as you have that survival aid lessening, you can move to other programming interventions where people have cash for work, where people could have extension services when it comes to agricultural programs, or training where people can utilize land and maybe even resources to optimize food production. In our case in South Africa, we don't particularly talk about food production because a large number of our households, in fact, more than 90% of households are dependent on buying food. So food procurement and therefore food cost and food economic access is so important for us. But it's still in the student conversation, we need to be painting a picture of how many of our students actually can't afford a healthy diet. And therefore, we need this humanitarian or survival aid. Now, pre-COVID, we had data from 2016 that showed us that one, food poverty in terms of economic access, people were not able to actually buy food for the month. So in the blue map, you will see that the percentage of households across the South African provinces who ran out of money to buy food, and on average, about 22% of households in South Africa were not able to buy food. What is very interesting is to see that compared to the Western Cape, Limpopo, which is a rural province, was able to actually survive on food production. So less households actually ran out of money to buy food because they're actually producing food. And we should take a lesson out of that in terms of food production. Households that are dependent on food grains, this shows you that as a basis, when people don't have enough money, they tend to eat more starchy foods. And you would know that starchy foods are the energy dense foods, and they're not always the most um, nutrient dense in terms of your vitamins and minerals. So it really gives you a poor diet because it's starch laden. And you'll see that generally in South Africa, for every 100 Rand, 30 Rand was going towards starch. And again, if you look at urban rural, then our rural areas are spending a lot more money on starchy foods than on foods that would be giving, that would able to give you nutrients. So when we talk about food in the context of nutrition, it has to have the nutrition dimension, the health dimension. So not just to fill the tummy, but to actually nourish the body. And we need to be thinking about this because now in 2020, NIDS-CRAM showed data that 47%, close to 50% of households are running out of money to buy food. That is disastrous for a country. And therefore, we need to be thinking progressively about how we're going to be able to actually produce food at the household level. Now, what we eat depends on how much money we have. And we'll see that in South Africa, our actual fast food industry has grown significantly. And when you look at the data and the reports from the higher education, you will see that one, our fast food consumption among students is very high. And that is not only the commercial fast foods, but it's also the street fast food. So if you talk about a spatla, which is the local name for street foods, we have, this is because one, it's low cost foods. Cheap foods are being sold at universities. Those are being sold at higher amounts because, again, it fills the tummy. Students don't have time to cook. They don't have time to prepare. So it has quick turnaround for convenience. Students don't have access, particularly in their accommodation. They don't have the infrastructure to be able to cook a meal that is actually a healthy, nutritious meal. So therefore, they're also buying things that you can fry or things that you can heat up very quickly so that you can have a meal. And the other thing we don't think about is the food culture at universities or institutes of higher education is this isolation and solo eating. When you are with a family, you tend to eat better, not only because somebody is catering for you, but there's also that social dynamics around food. We do have a food culture. And if you think about any important time in your life, you'll think about the food that went with it. And at universities, the kind of foods that people are accessing and how they are eating is it's very lonely. And we talk about solo eating. So now coming to how do we position and use advocacy? I think for South Africa, we need to look at how the feeding scheme around the national school nutrition program was activated on the basis that it is the constitutional right to basic nutrition and basic education. Now, I know we are talking about higher education, but we need to think about how do we reposition food support at higher education level. If we're saying people have the right to education, and we have, after the whole fees must fall era, that we are now focusing on education and government is funding poor households to actually access education, then surely nutrition support should be part of that package. So finally, I would like to say that in thinking about this, I think South Africa should be investing in a universal basic income grant, that it should be also for the age group 19 to 59, because this is the group that is actually left out of social network safety nets. That if we want to support food, it's about making food available. And for child nutrition, we are advocating and we are pushing for food baskets that are either subsidized or fixed price so that we can have better food at the household level. At universities and institutes of higher education, we need to be looking at the food environment. And that means that we need to be providing foods according to the food insecurity stages that I showed you. If people don't have the money, we must be doing humanitarian support. Where people can be subsidized, we need to look at subsidization. Where we can produce food, we need to be producing food. And so this will call for innovation. And we need to think about how do we, in the post-COVID time, talk about accessing food online through procurement systems like your you know, your delivery, order and deliver. Why can't students have an order and deliver system? How do we produce food at our institutions? And how do we help students to prepare food that also helps them to nourish their bodies and their minds? And so nourishment must be part of that supply, that food supply system. So that is a short presentation around the thoughts I have on repositioning food and nutrition in the context of students. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Witten, for that really detailed and interesting presentation. I have no doubt you'll get some questions later. And for those asking, we will be sharing the presentation as well. I also really enjoyed the variety of vulnerabilities that you spoke to, particularly access to food and the socioeconomic issues that we tend to overlook. I think most of us know that the issue has never been food production or the amount of food, but that most people, students in particular, just don't have physical and economic access to that food. So thanks again, Dr. Witten. If you'll allow me to invite our last speaker, Lindokuhle Mdabe, who is currently research advisor to Commissioner Sibanyoni at the South African Human Rights Commission. He has worked as an attorney and researcher at the Socioeconomic Rights Institute and as director of programs at the Legal Advisory and Information Center. His research interests include land reform, the right to a healthy environment, and the right to food. Linda, you have 15 minutes to take us through your presentation. The floor is yours.
Hello, are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Right. So basically, I'll start by speaking about the role of the Commission, not the Chapter 9 institutions. There's a number of them. Probably not talk about the IAC and their relationship with the right to food. I'll talk specifically about the role of the South African Human Rights Commission. And basically, this is how we structure this. So the first part of this presentation will talk about the general mandate of the South African Human Rights Commission. And then the second part of it will talk about the interrelatedness or the interconnectedness of the right to food and the right to education. And then the last part will talk about the plan of action that the office of Commissioner Sibanyoni, whom I'm working with as a research advisor, that the plan of action that he has in his office right now in relation to the hunger that is being faced by students at tertiary institutions. So the first part of it, I suppose, is really where I need to talk about. Hello? Hello, are you guys able to hear me?
We can hear you. Can I please ask that everybody else mute themselves? Thank you. You can continue, Linda.
Yes. So the first part is to try and locate what the mandate and what are the powers of the South African Human Rights Commission. So I suppose the Constitution, for instance, in section 184, talks about the powers of the South African Human Rights Commission and says that the South African Human Rights Commission has the mandate to promote the respect for human rights and the culture of human rights. And the second part is to promote the protection, the attainment and development of human rights. And then the last part is really to monitor and assess the observance of human rights. The powers of the Commission are also set out in the same section as well. It is to investigate and make reports. And it is to also to take steps to ensure that there's appropriate redress where there are human rights violation, and also to carry out research and to educate. These powers are also supplemented by the enabling legislation, which is the South African Human Rights Commission Act, which was promulgated in 2013. But I think it came into effect in 2014. So in terms of that act, the South African Rights Commission is obliged to make recommendations to government to adopt measures aimed at the promotion of human rights using the constitutional and other legislative measures. So the Commission can propose that legislation be adopted in order to promote a specific human right, and I'll talk about that later and why I think it's important for our conversation today. And secondly, the Commission can conduct studies in order to assess whether the implementation of human rights. And thirdly, the Act also requires government to provide the Commission with information. And the Commission is also required to conduct human rights awareness programs and to coordinated work with institutions that have similar mandates, and also to consider recommendations that might come from those similar institutions as well. But also to review government policy using these human rights standards, and to monitor implementation of domestic laws and regional laws and international treaties in relation to human rights, and to prepare reports for the National Assembly on international human rights law, and where it can refer matters for litigation. So really, the powers of the Commission are wide and are set out in the Act that regulates the work of the Commission. And another component is that the Commission also has powers to mediate and to negotiate where there are disputes that arise from human rights violation. I think even though it is now an established principle of our law that the right to food and the right to education complement each other, and that under the COVID-19 pandemic, the South African government is under a clear constitutional obligation to provide access to food to children, even if they are attending school or they are not attending school. There is a clear link between the right to food and the right to education, and I think that is well established now in our law. And I suppose now the gap that now exists is that when one looks at the tertiary institution as a site for implementation of the right to food, one really does begin to find that there's a gap in that site, and because there is no legislative framework that set out what needs to be done, despite that there is overwhelming evidence that there is hunger in tertiary institutions. So the Office of Commissioner Sibanyoni has proposed that perhaps the best way going forward is to conduct a nationwide inquiry into the state of food and nutrition security and the constitutional fulfillment of the right to food of students within tertiary institutions, in order to assess whether there is a need for policy and legislative intervention that might provide solutions to a number of questions. I'll deal with the questions later, and first I need to explain why this is important, that a nationwide inquiry be conducted, at least by the Commission. It's essentially because one of the powers of the Commission is to conduct an investigation. What that involves is that the Commission then calls out invites rather the different stakeholders, state actors or non-state actors, to come before the commission and to provide submissions on what needs to be done. And that is a good base to start. And then the commission then after that makes some findings, and then those findings we are made to believe, given the public protector's judgment, that those findings are binding, and those binding findings may be enforced against government institutions that are implicated in the implementation of the right to food. And so I suppose the first part of that inquiry would be to assess whether there is a need for any legislative or policy intervention to look at what may be a theory on international law and regional laws and even constitutional law, basically on how they deal with the right to food. And then the second part of that would be to assess another theory on accountability. That is really to think about which part of government is responsible for discharging this constitutional obligation, because as it stands right now, no one is really sure about which part of government, when one looks at the department, or even if one looks at all spheres of government, one is really not sure which part of government is enjoined to implement the right to food. But also one may also look at the criteria for qualification and disqualification, if that is possible. Those are just ideas that might form part of the inquiry, and also look at the budget allocation mechanisms that might inform all of that as well. But the inquiry in the commissioner's mind is that it might assist to sort of like answer a couple of questions that are important for how the right should be implemented, and who is the duty bearer, and to what extent, when one looks at the substantive content of that right, can that right be implemented, and what are the resources that are available from government to implement that right, and to make recommendations on what is possible, having taken into account the participation of all relevant stakeholders. So that is what the plan of action is inside the Commissioner's office at this stage. Thank you very much. I think that's the end of the presentation. I'm able to share the presentation because I'm reading from a PowerPoint presentation. This side, I'm able to share it via email at a later stage, should you require it. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Linda. Yeah, just to clarify, we'll share all the presentations after the webinar so everybody can go through it in their own time. Thank you again for that presentation and for reinforcing, you know, a human rights-based approach to the right to food and issues of implementation and legislative framework, which has been an ongoing issue. So I've no doubt you will get some questions as well. I would just like to thank all three of our panelists for really detailed, insightful, and to the point presentations. I'll now hand over to my colleague Phuminola to lead the Q&A and then deliver the closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paula, and thank you to the three presenters. Those were very engaging presentations, and I would say there's a lot to take home. Before we start the Q&A, I just want to do a brief recap of one or two basic points from each of the presentations, and then I'll lead us in the Q&A session. First, from Rhondelene's presentation, I loved your beginning where you said, and you ask, are students not a vulnerable group? And I think this speaks to the heart of the matter on why, like you rightly said, the issue of student hunger didn't just begin today. I speak to several people who studied 10 years ago, who studied 15 years ago, and they can still relate to having to skip meals, not having enough meals. And yet, several years down the line, this is something that is still not addressed. So the question, which is at the core of today's debate, is, are students not a part of vulnerable group who are also entitled to the protection as guaranteed constitutionally with regards to the right to food? And thank you very much, Dr. Chantell, for your very, very insightful presentation. And I think your presentation also responded to Rhondelene's presentation, which says that students have not so far been captured as a vulnerable group. And I think that begins the question and answer session for me. The question for me is why? Why, despite all of these accounts, and I do understand the dearth of research with regards to not capturing what's going on within tertiary education sector as probably being part of the reason, but is that the only reason we have? Also, there's something you said that kind of like struck a chord for me, where you said hunger and malnutrition is trauma, and there's a need for us to begin to frame students in food insecurity differently than it's currently framed within the tertiary education sector. Lastly, with regards to Linda's presentation, I thank you very much for bringing on board the role of the South African Human Rights Commission with regards to this. You are aware that we've been engaging over the last couple of years with the South African Human Rights Commission. Even when we started off this project in 2017, at virtually all of our engagements, the South African Human Rights Commission has been well represented. And up until last year, where we officially presented a petition on this issue to the South African Human Rights Commission. And I think for me, that kickstarts the question and answer session. So my first question, before I open up the floor, goes to the South African Human Rights Commission. Now, I'm aware that in 2017, the South African Human Rights Commission gathered together civil society organizations to report on its findings on the right to food in South Africa. I'm aware because I was at that meeting, and one of the first issues I pointed out then was that the commission, there was this gap. The report, as beautifully written as it was, as much as it covered so many sectors, missed the sector of tertiary education. And I asked them what was being done. And the commission did acknowledge that that was one issue that wasn't probed and it would do better. In 2019, again, the Dullah Omar Institute presented a petition to the South African Human Rights Commission. And I'm glad to hear that the Office of Commissioner Sibanyoni is beginning to think towards starting up a probe nationwide on this issue. But beyond the probe, I just want to hear, are there other plans, such as engaging with Parliament, such as also engaging with other key players in the sector, such as NASFAS, engaging also probably with university administrators on what they think is happening with regards to student hunger? The truth is, if the probe starts today, it's very unlikely that that probe will be concluded in another 12 to 18 months. The question is, what happens to students between 12 and 18 months? Do we continue to ask students to go hungry until such a time as the probe is concluded? Or does the commission have short-term plans with regards to what is a very urgent matter from the statistics that is currently available? Are there short-term plans for the commission to engage with deciders, people who actually can get the ball rolling to begin to respond to issues around student hunger in our society? Rhondelene, the question to you that I have here is, how do you think students can become active instead of just this, what do I call it? Instead of just being, passive in their response to issues of food insecurity? How do you think students can become active with regards to organizing, with regards to demanding that the issues around student food insecurity be resolved in the shortest time possible? Chantell, you have a couple of questions here that I'll just read out. And maybe after this first round, then I'll give the floor to the speakers to respond. If there are further follow-up questions, then I'll also read those out. So Chantell, a question says, can we also consider a household food production scheme when you're looking generally at food insecurity and within the context of tertiary institutions? Post-COVID, do you think that there should be an encouragement towards students also beginning to grow their own food with the with the latest mechanisms that are available, people growing foods on the roof, having these little patches of land all around campus to grow food on? Secondly, how can we begin to change the food culture of students? I'm very happy that your presentation alluded to the food environment in many universities. Hello? Okay. I'm happy that your presentation alluded to the food environment in many universities, and that has been a problem for years. Can everybody please mute? Thank you. So the question then is, in changing the food culture of students, is it just a question of what students have access to? Because you had rightly said, students buy junk food, students buy all those foods because it's the cheapest kind of food. So changing that and replacing with what? Or does it also come with education? Can you advise us on that? The third question for you, Chantell, is that more like a statement. It should be a compulsory part of the curriculum to teach people how to grow food, since this issue of hunger goes far and wide. I do agree with that. And lastly, how do we encourage food production schemes in high density areas or informal settlements? And let me also add, within RESs in tertiary institutions, where land availability for backyard farming is limited. So I think the same way the presentation started, we'll go to Rhondelene, then Chantell, and then Linda.
Thank you for that question. Yes, I think it's very important for students to be actively engaged in this conversation, and not just to be engaged in the conversation, but to be actively part of the solution. So I would have to say that for a student body, it's extremely important to firstly admit that there is a problem. It's food insecurity and student hunger is not something that is often talked about on campuses. And when we speak about food insecurity or student hunger on campus, students don't really know the context of it. Students really know what's happening around it, or they don't even really know that there is a problem. We are experiencing it, but because there's not a lot of talk about it, that's why we don't put much attention to it. So I think in having students being not educated, but students being made aware that it is a problem, that student food insecurity and student hunger does exist, in order for them to relate to that problem, because I'm pretty sure students can easily relate to that. And then having to admit firstly that they are part of that problem. I'm a firm believer in following process and due course and looking at the different levels. And when we look at the student, the SRC at a university, those are the voices of students. So if we can approach the SRC as a student body and say, listen, but this is a problem, and you need to lead us into this conversation, or you need to lead us to a specific body or specific institution at the university that we can engage in on this topic, then it can open up the conversation. It can open up the platform for more and more students to be able to identify themselves with this problem. So having students to admit and having students to engage with SRC, because that should be their first point of call. The SRC should be the body that leads students to this specific conversation, and that should be able to highlight that there is a problem. And then also being able to make academics aware of the problem that do exist. Because there's a stigma at the university that when you are there, you're independent, nobody really cares about you. Nobody really cares about whether you are in the lecture hall or not, or whether you're listening or whether you're submitting. It doesn't really matter. So we need to lose these stigmas. We need to get rid of these false myths. And for example, get up and say to a lecturer, but listen, I have a problem. I don't have food. And I speak from first-hand experience, because in the EMS faculty at the University of the Western Cape, there is a project that deals with students, where students come in every single day and they say, but I haven't eaten for 3 days. When we look at these students as tutors and we take out our lunch bags and we give it to them, and automatically that issue is sensitized. Automatically we know that, oh, we are dealing with students that are dealing with real problems. We are dealing with students that are probably even struggling academically because they have to sit in the classroom where all they're thinking about is food, or where their next meal is going to come from. So students need to get involved by admitting that they are part of the problem and that there is a problem. They also need to address the SRC of a campus, because to me, that is the voice. That is the one arm that will take you to certain institution on campus, and that will be able, to be louder and to be a louder voice for you as a student body. And we need to get rid of the myths, and we need to get rid of the perceptions around student hunger and student food insecurity. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Rhondelene. To Chantell, please.
Thank you very much. So on the first question about food production and food production schemes, I think that we are in the era of stakeholder engagement, and there are many opportunities for students. There are many industries that look to students and fund students and have funding mechanisms. So why don't we engage them also on food production or food subsidization? I think COVID has taught us that communities can mobilize and can organize themselves. The feeding schemes in the Western Cape, particularly, they were called community action networks, raised more food and food initiatives than the government could ever do. And I think if the institutions themselves started to put their energies to engaging in a stakeholder forum and trying to bring in food so that we can subsidize our students and we can provide our students with food support. Every university has got a bioscience faculty, agriculture, dietetics. There is nutrition in your campuses. We should be engaging with them. We should be building them, because we are a community. When we teach our students about community engagement, why are we not using our campuses as communities? And we could have interprofessional programs where our students are training, where our students are doing exactly what we do in programming, but do it in the campus to support our students. I am very excited that I'm at the University of the Free State, because the University of the Free State actually has a plan, and they have many ideas that they want to take forward, including something like an online shop where students don't have to be spending their money outside at retailers that are costing us 500% markup. Why can't we subsidize these same commodities that students will be needing? And I would like to say with what Rhondelene said now, why isn't the SRC taking up these issues? We should be engaging the leadership, because hunger is shame. Nobody is going to tell you I'm hungry, because it comes with the banner of shame. Secondly, if I'm at a university, I can't be still grappling with basic things like not having to eat And we've all been there. When you started the introduction, you said you've spoken to many people. I was a student in 1990. 30 years ago, I was at UWC. 30 years ago, we used to buy hot chips and a loaf of bread. And that's what we ate while we were there from 7 o'clock in the morning till 7 o'clock in the evening. Students must mobilize themselves. Nobody's going to do it for students. And I think it is important that we take the lessons from the civil society. In this COVID times, the civil society has shown us that it can be done, and they have done it. Undoubtedly, we need food and nutrition education. I think it should be a basic across all faculties. Every university I've worked at, this is my 4th university, I put it down as something that I would like to pursue in that university, that we have these, it doesn't have to be accredited course, but students should be able to access. With now we have online learning. We could have one program that every university across all African countries could access on basic nutrition literacy. All the data from South Africa says that nutrition literacy is low. People have money, but they buy the wrong stuff. People don't know how to actually make good, healthy meals. And I think we should be doing it. We're doing it at schools, and it's finally in the school curriculum. Now let's bring it up to our tertiary education. So definitely we need education. And then how do we grow food in small spaces? Again, you cannot believe during this COVID time how many food gardens have been established, how many food networks have been established, how many food system changes are taking place, pushed by civil society, not academics. We sit in our offices wanting to write papers. Practitioners are out there finding solutions. We need to be gathering that information, and we need to be advocating with that evidence. It's different kind of evidence now. We need what we call pragmatic evidence to start making inroads into academia so that we can influence policy. And that is what advocacy actually is. And so I want to challenge those that are in student environments. We start small, and we start building, and we start pollinating across the different campuses. And there are nuggets of good practice happening in our campuses. We just haven't documented it. And I understand now from the Human Rights Commission that you have funding for research. This is the kind of research we would like. And this is the kind of research that's going to change the policy agenda. I think I've answered all 3 questions.
Yes,
I hope I haven't missed anybody. Okay,
thank you very much. Thank you. And finally, we'll go to Linda.
Yes, so I suppose I need to start here. The Human Rights Commission has done two reports, which I think are important reports. And the first one has not really been published. And the first one was a gendered approach to the right to food. And this does not talk to what we're talking about today. And then the 2017 report. And I do admit, and in that report, the tertiary institutions, in particular, the hunger of students in tertiary institutions was left out, and that really was a blind spot on behalf of the Commission. But after the petition was received, and then a board paper within the Commission itself was done to share some ideas internally about what could be done by the Commission using its mandate to ensure that there's implementation of this right. Has a long-term plan, and I suppose as a sustainable plan going forward. And this is really set out in the report that you have written, and also and it's a reasonable suggestion to say that there should be policy and legislative intervention, at least in this side, to ensure that there's a sustainable plan. But in order to arrive at that, there must be a place where we start with the conversation between different stakeholders. And these stakeholders are and could be non-state actors and even state actors, to talk about what could be the principles that we can establish suggest a policy intervention or legislative intervention going forward. And I suppose the inquiry could be limited on that scope. But as a short-term plan, this is what the Commission has done, and I suppose this may include other strategies that the Commission has done under COVID. The Commission, the Office of Commissioner Sibanyoni in particular, invited some ministers, and including the President, to a conversation to talk about the implementation of the universal basic income grant by government, and I think government has taken that to be an important issue for policy discussion going forward. And as a result of that conversation, they then promised the Commission that they will get back to us in relation to that intervention. But the Commission has met with relevant ministers to talk about the right to food in general. But in that conversation, the pieces that were dominating was the food parcel issue, because that was a dominant issue during stage 1, stage 2, stage 5, stage 4, stage 3 of COVID, and then we moved to the issue of basic income grant. Really, there wasn't any attempt by the Commission to negotiate on the hunger of students at the time when they met the President. But someone asked a question as to when the inquiry would start. For the inquiry to start, there needs to be a concept paper inside the Commission. I'm sorry, I'm telling you about the administrative part, but that is already done. There's a paper inside the Commission. Now it's a matter of setting up a panel and then allocating the budget, and then doing invitations of people who might come and present information before the Commission. And then after that, then there will be a report. Then there will be a report with recommendations, and then we can use those recommendations to lobby government to find a sustainable solution to this. Yeah, I really do agree. In the meantime, we may struggle to find an immediate solution to this, other than to find some other plan to engage some departments in the state to come and assist. But as a long-term situation, as a long-term plan, the Commission has adopted the strategy that we need to find a policy and a legislative framework, because this site is important for the implementation of the right to food, because there's really a gap there. I hope I answered all the questions.
Yes, you have. Thank you very much. That was insightful, and at least we're glad to hear that there is some movement with regard to our petition. We look forward to that inquiry actually starting. And of course, as usual, we're very available to help advise the Commission on the research that we've conducted over the last couple of years on the issue of access to food for students. On that note, and taking into account our time, most of all of the other comments that have come through have been comments. I'd like to say someone noted that this issue is not just about, we need to differentiate and see how to target this interventions, because most times people assume that funded students are covered, whereas funded students also face issues around student hunger. And that's very true. We're going to share a couple of some of the materials we've come up with over the last 3 years with participants, and we invite each and every one of you to please join us. This is not a project that started today. It's something we've been working on for a couple of years, and I think that we are stronger together. The more people we can have from different universities who are pushing for impact, who are pushing for a resolution to the issue around student hunger, the better and the sooner we would see a resolution. Someone had also noted that shouldn't the retail sector be involved? And my answer is a resounding yes. The retail sector should definitely be involved in this conversation. It's a conversation we've also tried to have with the retail sector. Like Paula had earlier mentioned, this is the first part of a 2-part webinar. The next webinar comes up in a couple of weeks, and we would also be sending out the invites. That invite will also touch on issues around what the responsibilities, if any, we envisage for the retail sector with regards to student hunger and what we think could be done. On that note, I would like to say a big thank you to everybody who's come here today, who's listened, who's engaged. And an even bigger thank you to our presenters. Thank you for starting the discussion. I don't think this is a discussion that really ever ends. And I usually encourage that we take the discussion beyond here. We begin to envisage in what ways can we actually become advocates for students. Even if we're not students ourselves, in what ways can we advocate for students? In what ways, through what we do, through the work that we do, can we begin to make impact to help students who are hungry? On that note, from the Dullah Omar Institute, we would like to say a very big thank you for giving us the last 1.5 hours. We know that's very tasking, especially in today where there are 1,001 things for everybody to do. So we say thank you, and we hope that you'll join us to continue this conversation in our next webinar. The invitation will be sent out, I think, within the next week or so, and we hope to hear from you. We will be forwarding the presentations, which I see many of you have asked for. We would also be forwarding a couple of our materials, which we've worked on over the last couple of years on this project, the Access to Food for Students project. We welcome partnerships all the time. And so if you have ideas, if you think probably we have some blind spots coming from a legal and human rights perspective, perhaps there are some things we're not taking on board, maybe from a dietetics perspective, we welcome your partnership, and we would say, please drop us an email. We would also put in the materials, our emails, the emails through which you can contact us. I'll also drop my email on the chat. If there's something you need to say to us, please feel free to send us an email. Thank you very much, everybody.